Imagine a fortress rising from the sea before you, where you realize you cannot surround an island with infantry standing on the beach. Previous empires like Babylon had besieged this city for 13 years and still failed to break it. But Alexander the Great didn't accept the impossible. He decided to build a road through the sea straight toward the island fortress. Prepare to witness the strangest and most insane siege in history, where a king forced the Mediterranean to carry him into battle. If you live for stories that defy destiny and want to uncover humanity's greatest triumphs, subscribe right now and leave a like. Iron, blood, and the ocean await us, and you will not want to miss what is about to unfold. Picture standing on a beach with the greatest army on earth behind you, and none of it matters. Your enemy sits on an island out in the water, and every soldier you command is useless the moment the sand ends. This is the wall history swore no man could touch, seen from the wrong side of the sea. So ask yourself the question that haunted Alexander that January: how do you strangle a city you physically cannot reach? Babylon, one of the mightiest empires the world had ever produced, once threw 13 full years at these walls and walked away with nothing but dead men and wasted time. You have to grasp what that number really means. 13 years is a childhood. It is a generation of soldiers who grew old at the water's edge and died convinced the place was untouchable. To the people living behind those walls, the sea was not a defense. It was a god, and it had never once let them down. And this was not a young man throwing himself at a wall for glory. March south toward Egypt and leave this fortress breathing behind you, and its ships could cut your supply lines and stab you in the back. Tyre was not a detour. It was the lock on the entire eastern sea, and he could not leave it shut. But Alexander did not begin with violence, and this is the part most people never hear. He came first with a request that sounded almost humble. He asked only to enter the island and sacrifice inside the temple of Melkart, the god the Tyrians held above all. To him, it was a courtesy. To them, it was a trap. Because letting a foreign king walk into that temple meant one thing to Tyre. It meant bowing. It meant admitting he was already master of their city before a single stone had been thrown. So they refused him flatly and told him to make his sacrifice on the mainland, far from their sacred ground. Alexander swallowed the insult and tried once more. He sent envoys across the water, offering the city a final chance to open its gates and avoid a war it could not win. It was the reasonable move, the mercy of a conqueror who still preferred surrender to slaughter. What Tyre did with that mercy sealed everything that followed. They killed them. The Tyrians murdered his envoys on the spot, dragged the bodies to the top of those famous walls, and hurled them down into the sea in full view of the Macedonian camp. It was not just a refusal, it was a message written in blood, and every man on that beach read it the same way. From that instant, this stopped being a campaign and became something colder. A war of strategy can end in terms. A war of vengeance ends only one way. The men who threw those corpses into the water had just told Alexander exactly how their story would finish, and he intended to prove them right. So he gave an order so absurd that the Tyrians laughed out loud from their towers. He would not wait for the sea. He would fill it. He commanded his army to tear the old mainland city apart, stone by stone, and carry its bones out into the water to build a road where no road had any business existing. Think about the sheer madness of that decision for a moment. He was going to walk his army across 700 meters of open Mediterranean, not by boat, but on a highway of rubble that did not yet exist. Thousands of laborers, mountains of timber, endless carts and rope, all thrown at water that had swallowed everything before. The first heavy stones hit the blue-gray water and vanished with barely a ripple. Then more, and slowly, meter by agonizing meter, something impossible took shape. A finger of land reaching out from the shore, pointing straight at the heart of an island that had never been connected to anything. The laughter on the walls did not last. It curdled into something else as the Tyrians watched the gap close. The sea that had cradled them for centuries, the moat no army could cross, was being erased in front of their eyes by men with shovels and stone. Their god was being filled in like a ditch, and here is where you feel the whole story turn. For the defenders, safety had always been a fact of nature, as certain as the tide. Now they were learning something terrifying about the man across the water. Alexander did not accept the world as he found it. If reality stood in his way, he would rebuild reality. If a story about a man who decided to move the ocean itself is the kind of history you have been missing, subscribe right here, because this is exactly the kind of forgotten war we rebuild from the ground up. Now stay with me, because the moment that road came within reach, the sea began to fight back. The closer the causeway crept to the island, the more it turned into a slaughterhouse. Out near the shore, the water was shallow and calm, but every meter forward meant deeper water, harder waves, and something far worse. The builders were finally drifting into range of the walls, and the men on those walls had been waiting. Arrows came down in sheets. Picture trying to haul a whetstone the size of a man while iron rains from above, and you cannot hold a shield and carry the load at the same time. You choose between defending yourself and doing your job, and either choice can kill you. That was every single day on the causeway. Then the boats came. Small, fast Tyrian craft slid along both flanks of the unfinished road, close enough for their archers to fire point blank into the crowded workers. Men slipped on slick stone and drowned in their own armor. Others were pinned in knee-deep water as waves and arrows hit them from two directions at once. So Alexander did what he always did when the world pushed back. He adapted, and he did it fast. He turned the raw tip of the causeway into a fighting platform, stringing up huge screens of hide and canvas to swallow the incoming arrows, and give his exhausted builders a wall of their own to hide behind. Then he raised two monsters at the very front of the road, siege towers taller than the walls of Tyre themselves, wrapped in wet rawhide so fire could not catch them. On top he mounted catapults that hurled stone and bolt straight back at the defenders. For the first time, Tyre was looking up at something that scared it. Understand what that image did to the men on the walls. A structure that should not exist was now crawling toward them across water that was supposed to protect them, and it was taller than everything they trusted. The impossible road was no longer a joke on the horizon, it was a weapon, and it was almost at the gate. And this is the detail that should stay with you. Alexander was not spending gold on this road, he was spending men, hour after hour, and he knew it. Each layer of stone that pushed the causeway forward was laid on top of the bodies of the workers who had died, placing the layer before it. But Tyre had survived 13 years against Babylon for a reason. These were not people who panicked. They looked at those towering wooden machines, soaked in rawhide, packed with men and catapults, and saw not a threat, but a target. And they began very quietly to prepare an answer that would turn genius into ash. They took an old transport ship and rebuilt it into something monstrous. They packed the hull with dry wood, poured in pitch and sulfur, and hung cauldrons of fuel from the masts, so the whole vessel would rain fire when it burned. It was not a boat anymore. It was a floating bomb, built for one target only. Then they waited, and this patience is what makes it so chilling. They did not rush. They watched the sky and the water until the wind and the current lined up perfectly, both pushing toward the causeway. Only then did their warships take the fireship under tow and start dragging it toward Alexander's towers. The burning vessel slammed into the front of the causeway and detonated into a wall of flame. The fire climbed the siege towers faster than any man could react, melting the rawhide that was supposed to save them, turning weeks of blood and labor into a pillar of black smoke visible for miles along the coast. And the Tyrians were not finished. As Macedonians scrambled with water and tools trying to save the machines, the enemy boats swept in along the flanks and fired into anyone who broke cover. You could not fight the fire and the arrows at once, so the towers burned, the men died, and the front of the road collapsed. For the first time in the entire war, Alexander's impossible road had been stopped cold. Not slowed, stopped. Everything he had spent months building lay charred and broken in the water, and the island sat out there untouched, its walls lit orange by the flames of his own engines. The sea had won the round. Now put yourself inside his head in that moment, standing in the smoke, staring at the ruin of his best idea. A lesser man packs up and calls it a hard lesson. But Alexander drew a different conclusion, and it was the one that doomed Tyre. The land alone would never be enough. He had to take the sea. Here is the problem, though. Alexander had almost no navy, and Tyre's fleet was one of the finest in the world. On paper, stealing the sea from Tyre was even more absurd than building a road across it, but absurd was where this man lived, and he had one advantage the Tyrians had badly underestimated: He had been conquering as he went. Every Phoenician city down the coast that had already bent the knee to him owned ships, and those ships owned crews. So he called them in. From Sidon, from Byblos, from the island of Cyprus, a fleet gathered, until more than 200 warships were riding the water under his command. Imagine being a Tyrian sentry that morning. For months the sea had been yours, the one place the Mad King could not touch. Then you look at the horizon, and it is crowded with sails, hundreds of them, flying the colors of cities you thought were your own. The ocean, your last god, had just changed sides. The Tyrian navy did the only sane thing. It pulled back behind the safety of the city, into the two harbors that had always been its stronghold. But that retreat was exactly the mistake Alexander needed. The moment those ships stopped controlling the open water, they handed him the one thing he had been missing for months. There is a cruel poetry in what happened next. For their entire history, the people of Tyre had built their power on the sea and on the fleets of their Phoenician cousins up the coast. Now those exact cousins, those exact fleets, were sailing under Alexander's banner to lock them inside their own harbors. He moved instantly. He sent his new fleet to seal both harbors, the northern and the southern, jamming the mouths of the city shut with hulls and iron. The sea that had drowned his towers and mocked his road was now a noose, and he was slowly pulling it tight around the throat of the island. And now the causeway made sense in a way it never had before. Protected by warships on both sides, the builders could finally work without boats swarming their flanks. So Alexander rebuilt the road, wider and stronger than before, and this time it crawled forward under the cover of a fleet that owned the water around it. Then he did something that felt like a nightmare to the men inside. He attacked from everywhere at once. Catapults pounded the walls from the land bridge, while ships carried artillery right up to the base of the city and fired from the waves. There was no safe wall left in Tyre. Every side was a front now. But do not underestimate these people, because they were not done inventing horrors. Cornered, cut off, and shrinking by the day, the Tyrians reached for tricks so strange that Alexander could never have planned for them. The next phase of this siege was fought not on the walls or the water, but beneath it. The Tyrians sent divers, real men holding their breath, slipping into the dark water beneath the Macedonian ships to find the anchor cables and saw through them with knives. Up above, the crews had no idea why their vessels were drifting loose, breaking formation, colliding. The attack came from a place no one guarded. Alexander's answer was brutally simple and brilliant. If they could cut rope, he would give them something they could not cut. He replaced every anchor cable with heavy iron chain. The next divers who went down found links of metal that no blade on earth could saw through, and the ships held firm exactly where he wanted them. So the defenders tried another way to keep the assault ships back. They heaved massive boulders off the walls into the shallow water at the base of the city, building a hidden reef of stone meant to gut any hull that dared come close. Macedonian crews had to drag those boulders out by hand, under fire, in the water. Read that again and let it truly land. Men were wading into arrow-swept shallows to shift rocks the size of carts, one at a time, just so their ships could get close enough to fight. Every stage of this siege found a fresh way to make the simplest task cost lives, and still the noose kept tightening. You start to understand the real nature of this siege here. It was never one battle. It was a contest of invention, blow for blow, where every clever answer from one side forced an even stranger answer from the other. Ropes became chains, shallows became reefs. Nothing in this war stayed solved for long. By now Tyre could feel the walls closing in from three directions at once. Squeezed by the causeway, hammered from the sea, starved by the blockade, the city was running out of everything except courage. And a cornered enemy with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind there is. Tyre had one gamble left. Rather than sit and slowly starve, they bet everything on a surprise. A squadron of their best warships burst from the northern harbor and caught the Cypriot ships off guard, ramming and crippling several before anyone understood what was happening. For one wild moment, the trapped city looked like it might claw free. But Alexander was watching, and he moved faster than they did. He personally led a counterattack, swinging his ships around to cut the Tyrian squadron off from the harbor before it could slip back inside. He destroyed them in the open water and trapped the survivors outside their own walls. Tyre's command of the sea was over. With that failed gamble, the island's final advantage died. The freedom of the open water, the thing that had made Tyre untouchable since before anyone could remember, was gone for good. Now it was just a city on a rock, surrounded, exhausted, and waiting for the one thing every siege comes down to: a crack in the wall. Alexander went looking for it methodically. He probed the defenses until he found a weaker stretch of wall near the southern side, and there he brought up his heaviest answer yet. Specialized assault ships, each carrying a massive battering ram, were rowed right up against the stone that had defied the world for centuries. Keep the promise of this whole story in your mind now. A wall no empire on earth had ever broken, a city that had outlasted 13 years of Babylon and laughed at a king building a road through the sea. Everything had led to this one stretch of stone near the southern harbor, and whether it would hold. Then the pounding began. The ram struck the same point again and again, a slow drumbeat of iron on stone that never stopped, throwing up clouds of dust that drifted down onto the sea. The wall groaned, it cracked, and then, after 7 months of everything Tyre could throw at him, a breach opened in the impossible city. You have to feel the weight of that single crack. This was the wall Babylon could not break in 13 years. This was the stone that generations swore was divine, eternal, beyond the reach of any army. And now there was a hole in it, ragged and widening, with the smell of sea and smoke pouring straight through. Alexander did not hesitate for a heartbeat. He ordered his elite shock troops, the hypaspists, forward, and boarding bridges came slamming down onto the broken masonry. The best soldiers in his army began pouring across the wet rubble and into the wound they had spent half a year trying to open in the wall. The fighting on that breach was a nightmare of close quarters. Men hacked at each other on jagged, slippery stone with the sea churning below, no room to maneuver, no way to retreat. The Tyrians fought with the specific fury of people watching their last wall fail, knowing exactly what losing it meant for their families. And they had every reason to fight like that, because everyone on both sides knew what a stormed city meant in the ancient world. There would be no mercy for a place that had murdered envoys and held out for 7 brutal months. The breach was not just a military failure, it was a death sentence. But courage cannot hold back numbers forever. The Macedonian pressure was simply too much, too relentless, too well supplied by that fleet in the water. Once enough soldiers forced their way through the gap, the defense did not just break, it shattered, and the fighting spilled off the walls and down into the streets below. Now the killing moved into the heart of Tyre. Through narrow lanes across rooftops into the ancient temples where families had prayed to the very gods the walls were named for, the slaughter followed. There was no front line anymore, no strategy, just a city being torn apart room by room in the fading light. After 7 agonizing months of fire, drowning, chains, and blood, the island that called itself untouchable was annihilated. Everything it had trusted had failed it in turn. The walls breached, the navy sunk, the sea stolen and turned into a road. The 3 gods of Tyre had each abandoned it, one by one. The price the city paid is hard to even write down. Thousands of civilians and defenders were killed in the final assault, cut down in the streets they had defended for over half a year. The revenge that began with 2 murdered envoys thrown into the sea was now being paid back 1,000 times over. For those who survived the massacre, the fate was almost worse. Many prisoners were crucified in a long line down the shoreline, left as a warning to every other city on that coast. The rest, thousands of them, were put in chains and sold into slavery. Tyre, as a free power, simply ceased to exist. And that was precisely the point. Alexander had not spent 7 months and countless lives on a small island city out of pride alone. Tyre was a Persian naval base, a dagger pointed at his supply lines. By erasing it, he ripped the enemy's fleet from the entire eastern coast and made the whole region his own. With his rear finally secure and no fortress left to threaten him from behind, the road south lay wide open. Alexander marched into Egypt almost unopposed, where he would be crowned as pharaoh and found a new city at the mouth of the Nile. He named it after himself, and it grew into the heart of the ancient world. And here is the part that touches your world directly. That city he founded at the mouth of the Nile still stands today, still carries his name, still sits on modern maps. A war fought over a drowned road 23 centuries ago left a living city you could fly into this week. History is rarely that literal. But the strangest legacy of this siege has nothing to do with crowns or empires. It is written into the earth itself. When the fighting ended, that colossal causeway of rubble and stone did not go away. It stayed, a scar of human stubbornness reaching from the coast into the sea long after the last soldier was gone. And the ocean did something no one expected. Over the centuries, the currents dragged sand against the sunken stones of the road, piling it higher and wider, year after year, until the water on either side quietly disappeared. The island of Tyre stopped being an island at all and fused permanently onto the mainland. So think about what that actually means the next time you look at a map. Alexander did not simply conquer a city that history swore could never be taken. He reached into the physical shape of the planet and changed it forever, proving his deadliest weapon was never his army. It was his refusal to accept the word impossible. If watching a man turn the sea itself into a weapon left you seeing history a little differently, then you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe so you do not miss the next forgotten war we bring back to life, because the people who refuse to accept the impossible always leave the best stories behind.